Very good afternoon, everyone. Very excited to be here. Before I start, I wanted to take this opportunity on behalf of CyberArk to thank PwC for having us, and also to give me this opportunity to talk about the future of cybersecurity, which we firmly believe that the identity security is the new perimeter. So a little bit about the agenda, what we're going to cover over the next 20 minutes, right? We're going to talk about new identities, new environment, and new attack methods. Very interesting, especially when we talk about or hear what the previous panel discussion has talked about. And then we're going to look into how the cyber identity security platform does in terms of securing the various identities. And finally, some question and answers if you have along the way. I'll quickly move into the identity itself. So earlier on, you probably have heard a lot of people talk about identity and then talk about how to reduce the likes of passwords, increases the likes of MFA and the likes of it. So interestingly, from CyberArk perspective, we actually see there are more and more identity being created today, right? Given that this identity are the likes of human and as well as machines, largely because of organizations adopting for digital transformations. So that actually propel a lot of machine identities and human identities being created along the way. All right, so that's one. And it becomes more important that at this point of time, organizations look into how do we then protect these identities. If you look into the next prospect of things is that in terms of our organizations, our environments, we are no longer back in the days, perhaps 10 years back. It is about brick and mortar data centers, virtualized machines being run off laptops or data centers. In today's environment, we are seeing more and more cloud engagements, hybrid environments, whereby with that, we also identify and witnesses that the access to all these cloud platforms, AWS, Azure, or even GCP, it is always through a very high standing privilege, right? Which often than not, it becomes over-privileged. That actually becomes a very complex situation whereby attackers identify as an opportunity, right? And as everybody talks about AI, attackers, they themselves are also leveraging and embracing AIs to launch new attacks onto all these newly created identities. So the idea here, as we look into that, is that what does that entails us? If you look into the last, perhaps 24 months, as we exit out of COVID, something that we have identified is that if you look into it, more than 90% of organizations today, in one way or another, have experienced an identity-related breach, right? And that what it encompasses is that adversaries are actually attacking on these identities and trying to escalate the privilege as we speak to become the source of truth, the source of the identity, right? So if you look at it, is that back then, you might ask, Jitson, how is that possible? Because if you look at it, is that in today's context, is that we are no longer just talking about IT administrators trying to be secured. Okay, perhaps one of the last personnel in your mind is that what happens to the intern within the organization? What happens to the vendors within the organization? How are we going to secure all these different newly created identities as we proceed further? And one of the things that we have identified and witnesses is that in today's context, a lot of all these approaches that we have talked about, we are very familiar with, are pretty silos, right? In terms of how do we provide IGA solutions to manage and properly identify identity gaps within organizations. We talk about access management solutions and how that becomes a very standalone view in terms of identity as well. So the next slides is just more for educational purposes, right? To supplement what we have identified so far over the last 2-3 minutes. If you look into the security incident that happened, a couple of months back, Okta is one that, is very high on the chart. Within a 12-month period, 3 security incidents related to identity happens. And that actually resulted in a lot of revenue loss. As you see that, a loss of, $2 billion in terms of valuation. And on top of that, we actually have witnesses that the company actually, created or introduced a 90 days product hot because of all this incident. All this because of an employee credentials or related risk being executed. Next, something that is very familiar to many of us here, which is MGM. Again, through a very simple social engineering attack, not to delve too much into the attack mechanism, but clearly what we want to showcase here is that the attack actually identifies or targeted to employees within organizations who have privilege to do the stuff. So through the MGM attack, it actually crippled the organization. And again, we have also witnessed through such a security-related incidents, there is a loss in terms of revenue, there's a loss in terms of the business reputation as well. And finally, as we talk about this, the last one on the chart here is about US government having lost more than 38 million records, government records in the year 2021, if I'm not mistaken. Again, this shows the significance whereby attackers not just targets IT administrators, but rather vendors, workforce personnel within organizations and try to compromise their rights to gain to the attack chain and then propagate their attack further on. So through these lessons, what we have identified is that, going back, as we have talked about access control, privileged access management, and identity governance and administrations, these are the typical area of focus that organizations will focus on as we talk about identity security. But I think that these are very saturated and very stand-alone mechanism. And let me give you an example why. If you look into the current access management solutions today, a lot of them are focusing on creation and management of the identities, not so in terms of securing them. As we move into the management of the privileged access management, a very traditional ones that you will see will probably be very focused in the likes of IT or even a traditional administrators. If you ask about what happens to my cloud administrators, those who are constantly creating new VMs, creating new workloads on the cloud service providers like Azure, AWS, or even GCP, what can I do with them? It's often a very standalone, very limited capability when it comes to that. And of course, when it talks about IGA, it is often being viewed as very, very complex. So this is what we call as what I call as a backdated, pardon my language, a more backdated solutions to answer to yesterday's problem. If you look into today's environment, we have new identities being created. We have a new environment, and we have a new attack vector. That clearly also identifies that perhaps we need a new approach to secure all the identities within the organizations by having a security-first approach, by unifying all those personas that we talk about here. That perhaps would be the new way of securing identities within organization today. I'm going to walk you through how that potentially can be done. Right? Stay with me here as I go from the top-down approach. Right in the center, you have the identity security. Right? As we go down to the first round plate, which is the access management, this is something that we are all very familiar with as we talk about commonalized approach, whereby typically we know the likes of SSO and MFA. And as we embrace a more modernized access management, you want something that is more cool, you want something that's more fast-paced, perhaps the likes of passwordless. That will entail to the basic of access control or access management within organizations. Go down the line, if you look into the polygram, the six-sided shape right in the middle, the privileged access management. This is really where you want to make a difference as compared to a traditional PAM solutions. Earlier on, many of the talk track, you have witnesses how everybody talks about MFA and SSO becomes key, and then you really want to reduce the privilege at the endpoint, the privilege of all the IT administrators. But what could be done right here is that, what about giving the right privilege access to the right personnel at the right time? That could be something that we can dwell about. And accompany that particular principle, it could be the likes of an intelligent privilege control in place, harvesting all this privilege access as we talk about. And the last part is really about the IGA forming the baseline in terms of what we want to garner in terms of identity security. So this is a result of the 3 earlier platforms or the 3 earlier domains that we witnessed, which is stylo, into one main, I'll say compiled view. You may ask, CyberArk, what do you have in terms of that, right? I would like to introduce the platform called the CyberArk Identity Security Platform based on this particular model that we talk about. Okay? It may seem a little bit wordy, a little bit overwhelmed, right? But again, allow me to walk you through from the top to the bottom, from the center down. You will see that at the core of this particular framework of the platform is the identity security intelligence, making sure that all identities are secured at the right space at the right time. As we go down the line of the security first access management, what we want to do is that not only do we want to embrace SSO and MFA, you want to make sure that everyone within organizations, right, they are authenticated, they are managed in the right way at the right time. It could be the likes of a passwordless approach to the situation whereby we also observe that many of the users today are using browsers to secure, or rather to do their I'll say, high privilege works. How are we going to provide the particular access to all these users? This becomes a security approach first. Going down to the second platform, as we talk about privilege controls, this is where, if you compare back to the likes of a very traditional PAM solutions, we are very much back then talking about standing privilege, what the IT administrators can do on the servers or on the databases. In today's context, we have evolved from that. We have identified that in an identity security first approach, it is not just about standing privilege. It is perhaps also about giving the just-in-time access to the vendor, to the intern who needs the access at that point of time. And once that is done, okay, we also want to embrace the likes of a zero standing privilege kind of methodology, whereby the account can exist on the target servers, but not the privilege. That actually becomes a more, I'll say, wholesome kind of framework whereby you're not worried about any of the identity being compromised today. Because even any identity that's being compromised in any part of the workflow, right, the user or the attacker do not have privilege to proceed further. And of course, at the bottom of it, you will see that the IGA part, the governance, providing all the executive levels in terms of visibility, what needs to be done in terms of audit and the various points of remediations. The various identities that we talk about, all right, in terms of securing, you'll realize that in CyberArk, we actually classify all personas, all personnels into 4 different buckets. If you will follow me from the left to the right, you'll notice that we do not just target on IT personnel within organizations. We want to make sure that everyone within organizations gets secured. Because based on the history lessons that we have witnessed earlier, the likes of Okta, MGM, we understand that attackers are not just eyeing and targeting the IT administrators. They could be targeting the sales directors, those who are in the sales. They could target the HR personnel or the HR director that's managing all your HR incidents and the likes of it. So this becomes very important for us to make sure that the workforce, everyone within organizations are being secured. As it goes down the line, on the second from the left, okay, we want to have a more targeted control when it comes to the IT administrators, making sure that not only do we provide standing privilege access or standing access control onto the traditional IT administrators, we want to make sure that all those who are doing, like for example, the cloud administrators, right, those who are vendors coming in on an ad hoc basis, they are also given the same level of controls and assurance, providing the likes of just-in-time and zero privilege, making sure that once they have done the work, their identities is being reduced in terms of privilege. Okay, as you go down to the second from the right, which is the developers. I think developers hold a very close and important place in many of our hearts. Why so? It's because they are one small group of users. I saw people that's shaking their head, right? I think there are one small group of users, but they tend to have a lot of requests, a lot of demands, and sometimes, when it comes to security policies, they have a lot of exception as well, right? That becomes a very important aspect whereby we want to make sure that while we are securing identity within the organization as a whole, as we talk about that being the new perimeter, we want to make sure that the developers are not left out as well. We want to make sure that we give them the corresponding requirements that they need to perform the day-to-day experience and to deliver the day-to-day tasks that they need to. And finally, more often than not, just in case if you forgot, there could be a lot of bots, a lot of machines, a lot of scripts that's running within organizations. That is also one area of aspects, as what we have witnessed earlier, or what we have observed, that attackers are actually leveraging on all these credentials, and we want to make sure that they are secure as well. So all in all, if you look into all this, is that these are the 4 personas that in CyberArk we have defined. And perhaps as you walk out of this session later, you might want to think, in my organizations, how are we dealing with all these 4 different personas, right? Clearly, everybody will be very familiar with the likes of your IT and developers, for example. But ask yourself this question: how am I making sure, from a cybersecurity perspective, that I'm securing my workforce users because I believe and I've seen that they can be privileged at any point of time, right? You can imagine my sales director in Hong Kong, Sandy, the moment she logs into the Salesforce applications, she's a privileged user, right? She's able to do a lot of changes that is critical to the business. But once she logs out of that, her privilege, or rather her identity, no longer becomes privileged. That particular workflow is very, very common in organizations today. So the question is that how am I going to secure all the individual personas? Right. The next slide, I'm going to showcase how that, based on the identity security platform that CyberArk has earlier, in terms of the workflow. Right. So on the top, when we first started, it's really the main bulk of the users in today. We talk about the workforce users. Right? It could be your CEO, it could be your temp staff, it could be just anybody within organizations. That today, the first thing that he or she logs in is really the laptop. And then after the MFA and the SSO, really the first thing that typically a user will open or launch, right, is the web browser. Because you want to make sure that you're connected to the likes of WhatsApp. Right? You want to check your Facebook and whatever not. And the necessary, I would say, enterprise apps. So this particular workflow shows that while the users creates or execute the task, it is possible to secure the identity at the first place, give the privilege that's required based on the task that he or she does, and then subsequently provide the audit ability as required. As you go down the line to the IT, this is perhaps something that you'll be more familiar with, is to talk about IT administrators, same thing through the likes of a laptop. Once you have logged in, you are able to perform the day-to-day tasks, regardless this is through the likes of a putty session and the likes of it. You get your typical session recording onto the typical, I'll say, traditional target resources. But what have actually evolved here is that IT administrators no longer just do about a target service, a target workload, right? As we embrace about clouds, you will notice that IT administrators are opening up more access to the cloud workloads. The question then becomes, how are we going to use the current control in place to execute and monitor them? And finally, we also want to make sure that the developers follow the same route, because once the developer performs the task, you give them the rights to perform the task. At the end of the day, when they have completed the task, you want to make sure that the corresponding privilege gets removed, and you enforce a zero standing privilege at the target workloads itself. And finally, the last part here is about machines. As the machine starts to query and execute the day-to-day tasks based on privilege, you also want to make sure that they get authenticated, they get the corresponding privilege that's required, and once the execution of the task is done, you actually remove the rights from the user itself. Right. I also want to end off this particular slide because I understand that this is a little bit it might be a little bit too much for everyone to digest in a short time. I actually have a very short demo to make it easier to comprehend. This is something that is closer to the heart. An IT administrator right now logging on to a database on the cloud. And what we want to advocate here is that this is a zero standing privilege whereby the user themselves, in this case is Wei Lun, right, do not have active standing access to the database in AWS. So what he's going to do here is that you will see that he's going to establish a connection to the AWS database here based on a new, I'll say, unique connection string. So what can you see here is that instead of a typical username and password mechanism, the user Wei Lun actually put in a long connection string telling the endpoint where to connect to. And what it does here is that other than a typical username and password, which is standing privilege or standing account at the server itself, Wei Lun actually uses his own ID, my apologies, to authenticate. Okay, from CyberArk perspective, what we do is that we then check for this particular user, Wei Lun, does he have the access, does he have the rights to connect to the Postgres database server in AWS? If so, CyberArk will help you to broker the connection using the privileged accounts that's required to do the job. So notice that in this particular aspect, right, Wei Lun at no time have a standing account or standing connections to the target resources. That's number one. Number two is that all this is being monitored and recorded that give you the visibility and audibility that's required. And finally, from the privileged access perspective, whenever any of the user's account gets compromised, you'll notice that the attacker have only access to Wei Lun's account as a victim and not directly access to the backend servers itself. All right? So with that, I have come actually to my last slide by re-emphasizing that in today's context, as we attend the PwC event itself, which coincidentally talks about securing identities, I urge everyone to, after this particular session, to rethink about how do you want or how can you secure every identities within your organizations, right? More often than not, what we have seen is that we urge everyone here to reimagine how you can actually protect your workforce users, other than just a typical MFA and SSO. What else can you protect or provide so that they can themselves, if in the situation of a compromise, they do not become the tool or the credentials for the attacker to propel an attack within the organization. We talk about modernizing PAM, making sure that the PAM solution that you have today not just answers to a typical IT connections to your brick and mortar data centers, but making sure that that particular PAM solutions or PAM control in place is modernized enough and capable to answer to the likes of your just-in-time or zero standing privilege requirement. Developers is always one of the special breed of people within organizations whereby we know that they can be noisy, they can be loud at times, but we also want to make sure that they are well protected. Because based on the various security incidents that happen, okay, many of times it is always the developers that get compromised because they are the ones that perhaps put security as one of the least within the priority, but at the same time, they hold the highest privilege within organizations. And finally, as we talk about this, the last part of the jigsaw puzzle is about machines, making sure that as we secure the human identities as well, we do not overlook and neglect the machines within organizations today. With that, thank you very much.